workshop for the City of Woodlands housing element. It's the 6th cycle housing element that looks at the years from 2021 through 2029. And thank you for joining us on this virtual workshop. I see that we have a couple of participants who've joined. So first, what I'd like to do is start with some introductions. I'm Cindy Norris, Principal Planner with the City of Woodland. We have Dan Sokolow, who's Senior Planner with the City of Woodland. We also have consultants who have been assisting us in preparing this with Lisa Weiss Consulting Incorporated, Catherine Slama, and David Bergman online. And I also want to give a shout out to Jay Kimura, who's assisting us in the back and will be helping us during the discussion portion. So I'd like to do just a brief summary, and then I'll turn it over actually to David and Catherine. So the purpose actually of our meeting today is really to present the draft housing element to the community and to the public. We'd like to go through and review the basic elements that are in the draft, the basic findings, go over some of the key goals and programs. I would like to let you know that, so we are releasing the draft now. There's actually a lengthy review period available to the public to review this document. You actually have through July 12th to review the document and submit comments to us. We have a housing element website on the city's webpage, and you can go to that website for any updates. You can, the document is available on the website and can provide comments to us as well. So I'd just like to say that input that you'll see in the housing element that is available for draft, for review, follows a fair amount of research, several months of research, as well as incorporating comments from the initial public input that we received. We held a number of focused stakeholder meetings back in February, and their input was actually part of the drafting of this element. So, and then I'd just like to indicate that at the end of this presentation, there'll be a presentation by Catherine and David. So at the end, we'll actually open it up for discussion, and you can participate and provide comments either via Zoom or through the phone. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to David.
Thank you, everybody. I will share my screen and start the PowerPoint. So again, thank you all for attending, and welcome to our first public presentation of the public review document of the City of Woodland's 6th cycle housing element. Why is this? So I want to just give a quick agenda of what we're going to talk about today. Again, I'm Dave Bergman with Lisa Wise Consulting. I'm joined by Catherine Slama, who is the project manager. And Catherine will be providing you with additional information and details about the project and the 6th cycle housing element as it relates specifically to Woodland. I want to talk a little bit about some housing element updates and some of the general conditions that we found in Woodland as part of the process. So that'll be the first couple of points in the presentation, the first 3 bullet points. Then again, Catherine will take a little bit closer look at the housing needs allocation, and there's a little bit of jargon which we'll unpack for those of you that aren't familiar with, and the site inventory. And then talk about some next steps for the public review of the housing element itself, and open the conversation up to for comments and questions, as Cindy mentioned. So with that, let me just provide a quick overview of what a housing element is. I know some of the audience may have participated in putting together a housing element in the past, maybe have been involved with some of our earlier stakeholder outreach and community outreach efforts as part of preparing for the plan. But for many people, this might be the first time that you've thought about a housing element, and there's a reason why. It's kind of a technical requirement in land use planning. So every community in California, city and county, are required to prepare a housing element. It's one of the 7 mandated elements of a general plan. So every county or city, so we'll say jurisdiction in California, has to do a plan. General plan has land use. It has other things like safety, noise, open space, conservation. One of the things it also has to have is a housing element. And the housing element answers the question of, can the city of Woodland accommodate its fair share of housing growth for the state and for the region? So the housing element is a little bit different than some of the other elements in the general plan, in that there are fewer degrees of freedom. It's not really a very creative process in some respects. There's certain things that a housing element must do. In fact, the housing element is unusual in that you're required to submit it to the state of California, to the Department of Housing and Community Development for certification. Your other elements don't need to be approved by the state, but this element needs to be reviewed and certified by the state. In order to do that, the housing element has to have certain components in it. It has to assess the conditions of the housing stock and the needs of the current residents of the community, particularly specified groups in the community, to make sure that their needs are met. You need to have a plan that talks about policies, goals, and objectives that will talk about how the city can accommodate these projected housing demands. And will also, and this is important, show how the city can meet demand for housing at all income levels. So it's not just the raw number of units, you also have to be able to accommodate below market rate units and finding spaces for those. So I've used this term fair share, and some of you may have heard this term RHNA before. And this is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And how that works is the state of California, through 2 offices in the executive branch, the Department of Finance and Housing and Community Development, come up with a statewide target for how much they think California is going to grow over the next 8 years. By the way, every jurisdiction has to do them in 8-year increments. This is the 6th 8-year cycle that's going on, and they go in regions. So right now, everybody in the Sacramento region, which is referred to as SACOG, is getting their housing element together for submission to HCD for review. So the statewide forecasted number then is disaggregated into different regions of the state. As I mentioned, the SACOG is one that covers for Woodland. And then from that, the counties and the cities who are covered by that jurisdiction, through a public process, develop a methodology to allocate that growth to each of the members. So that's where that RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Allocation, comes from. And what that says is that you need to show through your housing element that your city has the ability to accommodate that fair share of growth. And at different income levels, so not just market rate, but sub-market rates. But here's the important point. This plan does not require the city to build or initiate projects. This is not as though a project happens because of the housing element, but rather to ensure that the zoning capacity exists in the city and that there aren't constraints in the municipal code to prevent the development of housing. So housing element has to have 6 components in it. Again, like I said, it's not as creative as doing other parts of your general plan. So it's got to have a review of what happened in the last 5th cycle. Did you make the progress that the city was aiming to in the last one? An assessment, which is a review of the projected housing needs and looking at any statutorily designated special need populations. Then is the adequate sites, which Catherine will go into a little bit more detail for our plan here in Woodland, but it is identifying the suitable land that's zoned to accommodate this RHNA allocation. Then there's a housing resources assessment, which talks about what is available to meet that need. And then a constraints assessment, which talks about, again, is there anything in your municipal code that's preventing housing from develop, but also some things that are non-governmental, like are there market conditions that are in the way? Is there a problem with lending that is preventing housing from being developed, or are there also environmental constraints? And then finally, there needs to be an implementation plan with your goals, policies, and programs that are dedicated to meeting that need. That will be reviewed in the 7th cycle. So those all have to be in the housing element. So why update the housing element? It's a state law, but it's also, it's very good practice for a community to have a vision for how it wants to manage and accommodate growth. It's just the same reason we do any component of the general plan. But again, as I mentioned, the state does require this in these 8-year cycles. It creates an inventory of sites that are sufficient to meet the city's RHNA allocation, which, by the way, the state requires an annual report for the city to say where new housing units have been built in relation to these sites. It establishes policies and programs that help incentivize and guide the housing market in the city. And also, it's a good process to go through because, and one thing that we, we're pleased because we're helping the city to do this. It also helps you to look at your zoning code and update it, and to ask, are there things in the zoning code that are preventing the development of housing? Are there antiquated things in code? Codes are funny things. Things go into them for a good reason. Those conditions pass, time changes, but the condition stays in the code. So it's very important to step back and look and say, are we accidentally preventing the development of housing that we would otherwise be wanting to encourage? As many of you may be aware, the state of California has really seen housing as a priority at state government, both the executive branch and the legislative branch. And as a result, in the last couple of years, there have been a number of specific pieces of legislation that directly affect the housing element process. Again, as the housing element is an important tool in the toolkit of the production of housing statewide. And as we this seems to be it's clearly a strategic issue facing the whole state, which is a question of housing affordability and housing availability. And the state is very concerned about making sure that there's adequate supply to accommodate growth. So these are some of the more notable pieces of legislation. We don't have to go into all the details on all of them, although we can answer questions that you have about them. But there are a couple that are worth looking at a little bit more closely. One is AB 1397 from 2017. This established the rules essentially for identifying sites that are available for below market rate housing. So housing that would be for low and very low income households. And the state actually has required those sites to be of a certain size and at a certain density. And in Woodland's case, it's 20 dwelling units per acre. The state uses density as a proxy indicator for affordability in this site analysis. The other one here is SB 166, which is the no net loss. And there's a lot of confusion about that. But what the state was trying to do with this is that sometimes cities would identify a site as one that would be suitable for below market rate housing, and the property owner, who's not compelled to do anything different than what their zoning allows, would go ahead and maybe build out the site at 100% market rate, or if the city has an inclusionary housing ordinance, include whatever was their proportion for below market rate housing. And as a result, the sites would get sort of gobbled up that would be suitable to support this higher density, presumably lower income housing. What 166 does is it puts the onus on the city, not on the property owner, not on the developer, but an onus on the city to replace that site if it develops during the 8-year cycle right? And the city can no longer meet its requirements by income level. And then AB 72 put a little bit more teeth in this HCD certification. So HCD can withdraw their certification of the housing element if after certification the jurisdiction does something that's inconsistent with its housing element. And then they can notify the Attorney General, who has in the past taken action against cities and caused changes in local land use controls in order to meet housing goals. You don't want to run afoul. You don't want to do anything that gets you decertified. You don't want to do anything that doesn't create a certified housing element. Not having a certified housing element causes all kinds of problems for a community in terms of having access to grant funding, sort of fall out of good standing with the state. It's something you want to avoid. There's another one that's received a lot of attention, and this is a really interesting new addition to the housing element, and this is AB 686, which is a requirement to affirmatively further fair housing. So this requires that jurisdictions look at issues of fair housing within their city, identifying issues of segregation by protected groups or against protected groups, identify goals for remediating segregation in the community, and develop strategies to move towards these goals. This is a new requirement, and in fact, Housing and Community Development just promulgated the regulations or the guidance for what needs to be in the affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis at the very end of April. So what's happening for communities in the SACOG region that need to get their housing elements reviewed by HCD, same thing is happening down in San Diego. It's another early region, the Sandag region, is they're looking at the housing element, and that this affirmatively furthering fair housing section trails behind it. So we're in the process of putting that together. Fortunately, SACOG has made resources available to its member communities to fund this portion of the housing element, and the work is underway right now by SACOG and their consultants. So with that, let's start to talk a little bit about some of our key findings about Woodland, factors that go into the plans and policies that are included in the housing element update. And so we'll talk a little bit about, one, here's the process, and then two, some of the data. So again, we're in the middle of this, we're at the beginning of the 60-day HCD review. They will come back with comments, including asking for the affirmatively furthering fair housing component in that 60-day. And they'll have a letter of things that they'll want emphasized or addressed in the review. But it's also then an opportunity between this time and the focus groups and the process that began back in the winter of 2020 to engage the community in workshops like the one we're having today, and to reflect comments, concerns, observations into what eventually becomes an adopted element of the general plan, housing element that becomes adopted by Planning Commission and then the City Council. So in January 21, we had a public outreach component of some focus group meetings where we had identified, along with city staff, members of the community, stakeholders who were involved in community development and housing advocates, developers, as well as businesses and institutions. We talked about the housing element update process and discuss the opportunities and constraints to housing and development in Woodland, as well as understanding what policy or programs would help address issues related to the production of housing in Woodland. So talk a little bit about some of the housing needs and conditions. So Woodland's population is growing along with pretty much at the same rate as Yolo County as a whole. Since 2011, the city's population has added about 4,000 individuals, so growing at about a little under 3% out to 2019. It's about the same rate as Yolo County as a whole. One thing that's interesting is Woodland. Most of the units, or the majority of the units in Woodland, are owner-occupied. A little bit under 55%, which is higher than the average for Yolo County as a whole. So about 55% of the units in in Woodland are owner-occupied, and about 45% are renter-occupied. So it's a majority homeowner city, but by about 5%, which is a little bit greater than in Yolo County as a whole. Household size. So the average household in Woodland was 2.8 people. It's a little bit larger than Yolo County's average. And again, we generally see a distribution that one-person households are more likely to be renters. By the time you get to two and three-person households, more likely to be homeowners. That tends to be the distribution until you get to the very large households, 6 or 7-person households, of which there's only a few relative to the overall number of households in the city. So, and then they have a tendency to be renters. Overcrowding. Overcrowding is increasingly a problem in California housing, and it's a technical definition, which is more than one household member per habitable room in the house. In renter, about 12% of the renter households in the city of Woodland are overcrowded. About 3% of the owner-occupied households are overcrowded. A 12% number is a relatively high number for Yolo County. It's a low number for the state as a whole. And then there's severely overcrowded. That's when you have more than 1.5 people per room, and that's usually an indication of housing stress. And 3% of the households are renters, are in the severely overcrowded category, and about 1.5% are owner-occupied, have this severe overcrowding condition. The housing element requires us to consider the needs of special populations. So these are seniors, persons with disabilities, large households, farm workers, families that are female head of household, and homeless population, the unhoused population. So again, with Woodland, we can see that about 10% of the community's population has a disability, and we need to take a look at their accommodations, the ability to house residents with disabilities. And again, looking at the senior households, seniors make up about just a little under a quarter of all of the households in Woodland are headed by seniors, someone over 65. The majority of them are owners, but about 1,500 of them are renters. And again, looking at large households, which are households with more than 5 members, it's about evenly split between renters and owners. And female-headed households, about 20% of the households in Woodland are female-headed. But what's really interesting or unfortunate is the disparity there that shows the households that are at the poverty level. So households that are meeting the poverty level is about 9% of the households in Woodland, are about 1,400 households. Of that, little under 750 households, are female-headed households that are under the poverty level. So that's a special population that the housing element needs to be sensitive to the needs for this segment of the community. Other special needs populations include farm workers. This is the data is at the regional or county level. And of course, Woodland, Yolo County is an important agricultural area, so farm labor and the needs of farm labor are a important consideration as well in the housing element. Woodland has a few specified farm worker housing facilities. And then the homeless population, the unhoused population, according to the 2019 homeless census, there's approximately 240 homeless individuals in Woodland, of which 75% are in some kind of shelter. About 163 are completely unsheltered, and of those, 145 are considered to be chronically homeless. Cost and affordability is, of course, at top of mind for people living in Woodland, as they are anywhere in California. And the measure that we use for cost burden is whether or not a household is spending more than 30% of its income on its housing cost. So 35%, so about a third of the households in Woodland are cost burdened, and the majority of these are renters. 47% of renters are also, almost half of renters are cost burdened. And if you look at the extremely low income households, they are, with incomes less than 30% of the countywide average, you have a large number of households paying not only more than 30% of their income, the 285 households, you have 1,400 households paying more than 50% for the extremely low income population. For the city's low income population, people making between 30 and half of the area's median income, again, a significant number are paying more than 30%, and about 600 are paying more than half. As you move up the income level, this begins to reduce, and as you get to above moderate income, so people are making the average or above, there's only 10 households who are paying more than 30% of their household housing costs, rental housing costs on income on rent. So with that, I'll turn it over to Catherine to dive a little bit more into the RHNA allocation and the site inventory.
Yeah, just look at it.
Okay, thanks, David. As David and Cindy said, my name is Catherine Slama. I'm a senior associate at LWC. Very happy to be here today. So now that we have a little bit of an understanding of the types of housing needed in Woodland, so the types of people that the housing element is serving, a variety of income levels, a variety of household types, a variety of living situations, and a variety of housing need. And we also understand some of the challenges that the Woodland community faces with respect to housing costs. As David just went through, there's a lot of cost burden in the city of Woodland. So now we're going to go through the regional housing need allocation, which is RHNA, and I'll keep saying RHNA as the acronym for that, as well as the city site inventory. So the RHNA is the estimated number of units at a variety of income levels that the state of California projects that the city would need over the next 8 years in order to fulfill their current and future housing needs. So that's alleviating overcrowding today, as well as accommodating population growth. So in other words, this is saying how many units are needed to help ensure that the current and future Woodland community members have the access to the right type of housing at the right affordability level, and what is affordable to them. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what affordability really means, but first, this table here shows the RHNA for the city of Woodland in comparison to the region as a whole. And you'll see that the city needs to is projected to accommodate just over 3,000 units over the next 8-year period, with about a third of those units falling into the very low and low income household category. And the RHNA is a state requirement, and it's passed down by the state to the Sacramento region and then down to Woodland. And the RHNA really is how many units the city needs to plan to accommodate. And David went over this a little bit up front of the presentation, but the city isn't required to construct the units, although the housing element does include many policies and programs to help facilitate housing development at a variety of income levels. On the next slide here, I wanted to go through a little bit more about what we mean by affordable housing. So when we say housing is affordable based on income level, we mean really two things. The household group, the income group classification, so extremely low, very low, low, and moderate. And it's also based on how much you spend on housing costs. So affordable housing really means that it's affordable based on what you earn. So what might be affordable to one household is not necessarily considered affordable to other households because they may earn different, maybe different household sizes, and they may earn different incomes each year. So first, households of different sizes have different average incomes. But the median income for Yolo County for a 4-person household is just over $92,000 a year. And this doesn't mean that all 4-person households in Yolo County make that much money. They can make much more, much less, but that is the average for the county. And then the income group classifications are defined based on the relationship to this county average. So if a household in the very low income category earns between 30 and 50% of the area average, that means that household of 4 earns up to just over $46,000 a year. So that's the combined total income of those 4 people in that household. And the second factor of what determines what is affordable is how much the household pays on housing related costs, and that includes utilities. So because what is considered affordable depends on one's income, there are different levels of affordability. So for example, if a very low income household of 4 has an annual income of $46,000, what is considered affordable by the state is paying no more than 30% of that annual income on housing related costs. So I did the math, we do the math here. So $46,000 a year, that means that family of 4 or household of 4 would be earning maximum $13,575 a year. Spending $13,575 a year on housing related costs. That's total. But on a monthly basis, that's just over $1,100 a month on rent or their mortgage, including utilities. So you can see how very, just try to think about the community and, how many units are affordable for a 4-person household at that income level. So because those are often difficult to find just as a market rate out in the market, on the next slide here, we want to talk a little bit about what types of affordable options are available. It's difficult to find naturally occurring affordable housing for these lower income groups because we just did the math. That's a pretty low monthly rent without any sort of support. So there are different types of housing available to extremely low, very low, and low income groups. The first is deed restricted housing. So this is housing that's built specifically for lower income individuals. It's usually utilized, developers are usually nonprofits utilizing federal tax credits, subsidies, and these units must be reserved for lower income households, and you have to qualify for these units based on your income. So you have to have demonstrated need based on your annual income. Supportive housing is housing that also includes social services, and it typically serves special needs groups, often those who maybe are experiencing or transitioning out of homelessness. So it's not necessarily income-based, but usually the groups served by special needs housing do have an income limitation as well. Rent stabilized housing is where increases in rent are limited. It's not an income-based affordability category, but it does help maintain some degree of affordability depending on how stable the rent is. Rent subsidies, this used to be known as Section 8 housing. These are vouchers that help cover the cost difference between what is considered affordable, so that 30% threshold of one's income is affordable, and then these vouchers would help cover the difference between what the market rate cost of that unit would be. And lastly, we have a category here that we call market attainable. It's not technically an official category of affordable housing, and it's typically not available or affordable to extremely low or very low income households, but it does provide a housing option beyond what is above market rate or available to, premium luxury homeowners and buyers. So it may be more attainable or affordable to more moderately income households. These units aren't subsidized, they're not stabilized, they don't receive tax credits or deed restrictions. But because of certain factors like geography, housing conditions, the size of the unit, the age of the unit, and some of the associated amenities, they may be more affordable than brand new, larger units on very large lots. So going on to the next slide here. So now we have an understanding of what the RHNA is for the city, about 3,000 units at various income levels, very low, extremely low, very low, moderate, and above moderate. So there's a need for about 3,000 units at a variety of income levels. So the city performed a vacant land inventory to make sure that if developers wanted to come in and build housing, there's enough land that meet a variety of criteria to ensure that there's space to build these units if there's interest. So the state of California sets special criteria for land that is considered suitable for the very low and low income household development. So for the city's vacant land inventory, if sites meet these criteria, which are size criteria as well as density criteria of 30 units an acre, the city has identified those sites as suitable for lower income housing. There's not an obligation for these sites to be developed as affordable or low income housing, but the state would consider, and the city considers these sites suitable for lower income housing. The sites aren't obligated to build housing or to build affordable housing, and except as required by the city's zoning code and any of these cities' affordable housing ordinance requirements. Larger sites, which are most likely to be developed for single family or are assumed to be more suitable for moderate or above moderate income households. So based on the vacant land resources and the housing projected in the Research Technology Park Specific Plan area, the city has land with excess capacity to meet the projected need over the next 8 years. So this really means that there's more than enough land in the city today to accommodate the growth that's projected, pending developer interest, of course. On the next couple slides, we actually have mapped with the city these vacant sites. So there's two maps because we wanted to make sure that you could see some of these sites. The maps and the inventory are in the draft housing element, and I can go through that a little bit more in just a couple minutes. But the sites are identified throughout the city. So as you can see, the different shades of blue represent different suitability for different income levels. The dark blue is assumed to be suitable for above moderate income housing, and the lightest blue is assumed to be suitable for lower income housing. And the sites are a variety of sizes, and they're distributed in a variety of locations around the city, and they're not really clustered in any one area. And again, I wanted to note that the city has identified these sites for housing. This showcases that there's enough capacity for housing in the city, but housing can be built on other sites where housing is allowed that aren't listed here, and vice versa. Sites that are identified for housing may be developed according to the zoning regulations. So if other uses are allowed in that zone, the other things could be developed there. And it's the city's obligation then to find alternative sites. Being identified on the state inventory doesn't change rules and regulations that are in place. Okay, so now that we know that the city has enough land available to accommodate the RHNA over the next 8 years, let's talk through the housing element itself. So this is the outline of the table of contents of the housing element. This is the public draft housing element that is available for public review. There is digital copies available on the web, and there also are hard copies available at city and the library. And the housing element is divided into 4 sections. Section 1 is an introduction. What is a housing element? How do we develop the housing element? The relationship of the city's housing element to other parts of the general plan. Section 2 is the projected housing needs. This is the RHNA. This is an overview of the need over the next 8 years over these various income categories. Section 3 is housing resources. The bulk of the housing resources is the site inventory, which I just walked through, but the city did identify other resources, including financial and administrative resources, and this also talks about opportunities for energy conservation. It's always in the back of the state's mind to be furthering housing production as well as furthering our state's sustainability and climate change goals. Section 4 is the housing implementation plan, which I'll go through in a minute. And then we do have several appendices to the housing element. These are all of the technical analysis and data that support the plan, the recommendations, and the background information that was gathered to develop this. So the implementation plan. It's a fancy way to say it's the roadmap, the city's roadmap to achieving the housing goals over the next 8 years. It includes goals, policies, and programs. Goals really are that big picture of the city's big picture target related to housing, and there's 4 big picture goals. One's related to housing development, actually construction of housing. Goal B relates to the maintenance of housing, so that's maintaining adequate stock of housing at a variety of conditions. Goal C relates to equity and equal opportunity in housing, so this is furthering fair housing and preventing housing discrimination. And goal D is related to sustainability and energy conservation in housing construction as well as housing operations. For each of the goals, there are associated policies and programs, and many of the policies that are in the draft that are available for review are actually current policies. So a lot of these policies have been carried forward over the years because of their success, and they are still relevant to the city's goals today. Not all policies and programs are new. And then there are also are programs that go along with each goal, and programs are really the actionable items and actions that the city can take to implement and further their goals. So here we have goal A. I'm not going to walk through every policy and every program. We would be here all night. I would be tired of talking and you would want to just tell me to be quiet. So I'm going to go through just a few of them here. Please take a look, read the draft housing and what that is available. So goal A is really about the development of housing. So minimizing constraints, promoting infill, and supporting different types of housing to meet the city's different needs. So you can see that the policies are derived based on the housing needs. So as David mentioned, for example, there is a growing senior population in the city of Woodland. So there's a policy in place to ensure and help support aging in place. So there's a variety to ensure that there's a variety of housing types to allow seniors to continue to stay and live in Woodland and not get aged out by not being able to find adequate housing as housing needs change for seniors. The housing element, that goal also identifies some programs related to updating the zoning code, annexing the technology park specific plan area, and continuing to utilize the city's affordable housing ordinance and density bonus ordinance as incentives to encourage affordable housing construction. Goal B related to maintenance of housing. So this really is about rehabilitation of units that need repair and preservation of units that are currently affordable that are potentially at risk of transitioning over to market rate. So the city has programs identified to work with code compliance, to work on code enforcement, to help facilitate repair of dilapidated units or units that are not safe for habitation. It's important that the housing stock in Woodland is also safe, not just affordable. and wanting to work with agencies to prevent conversion of units to market rate. Goal C relates to equal opportunities. So this program includes several policies related to housing equity and fair housing, including promoting equal opportunity to housing and resources, preventing housing segregation, enforcing fair housing laws, and helping the processing of cases where housing discrimination is a concern, where there's been reports of housing discrimination. Programs include continuing the city's work with legal services and providing accommodation and flexibility from standards for persons with disabilities. And lastly here, Goal D deals with sustainability and energy conservation. Policies in this goal include site design to reduce energy consumption, adaptive reuse measures to avoid materials waste through demolition, so trying to reuse structures instead of demolishing them, promotion of energy saving techniques for residential, including solar panels and weatherization to reduce heating and cooling needs. Programs include education and promotion of residential energy saving techniques and supporting community programs like the Woodland Tree Foundation. So that is the draft housing element. As Cindy mentioned at the top of the meeting, the draft has been submitted to the state for their initial review. There is a 60-day review period that the state has to review the draft, and this review period is passed along to the public as well. So the public has until July 12th to review and submit any comments to the city on the draft element. You can comment on anything you like. You can comment on the findings, the research, the programs, the policies. It's all available for review and feedback. So there's different ways to provide input. You can write to Cindy Norris at housingelement2021@cityofwoodland.org. You can speak today verbally at the workshop that we're having now. There will be public hearings later in the summer for adoption, so you can voice your comments, support, or concern directly to the Planning Commission and City Council, or you can contact HCD directly. And then on to next steps. So next steps, as David mentioned, the affirmative relief furthering fair housing analysis is underway. The guidelines were released in April, so that technical analysis will be added into the draft housing element available for review by the public and be incorporated into the draft that ultimately goes to the City Council for adoption. The end of the review period is July 12th. The city will review and update the housing element as needed based on the state's review as well as public comment. And then the city will try to take this to adoption later in the summer. And that concludes our presentation. There's one more slide here, David. So we are open for questions, comments. There are two ways to participate. If you are logged in via Zoom, you can raise your hand feature. If you are dialed in by the phone, you can press dial 9 to raise your hand, and we will accept questions, comments. Thank you, everyone.
Currently at this time, nobody has their hand raised. Oh, we have one. Charlene, you'll need to unmute here in just a moment.
Hi there, can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
My name is Charlene DeWitt. I'm a staff attorney with Legal Services of Northern California. So we're really excited to be working with you guys on the housing element. Excited to get started. I did have a couple of questions. So one of the things that jumped out at me from reviewing the plan is that just over a third of your accounting for your RENA allotment for extremely low, very low, and low is coming from the research park. But then I didn't find very much detail in how that was going to be insured. It looks like that area hasn't even been annexed by the city yet. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about programs or plans to ensure that a third of the units that come from that project are for that low-income group?
Sure. Let me respond to that. So we included the Research and Technology Park because in looking at the guidance memo from HCD, it does allow the city to include lands that will be annexed within 3 years. And so the specific plan is currently under review. In fact, the draft environmental impact report is going to the Planning Commission at our next Planning Commission meeting on the 17th. And the project will comply with all of the city's affordable housing ordinance requirements. And similar to what we've stated here about these sites, the idea is that the specific plan identifies different areas of land that are zoned at different densities, and that those areas of land would be available for development in the near future. So that is our understanding of how we can incorporate new lands as we continue to grow in order to meet our housing needs. I also want to make a comment that I think as Catherine had mentioned, while the sites listing that is provided, it shows sites that meet the specific criteria provided by HUD, and in particular for the lower income sites, it has to be under 10 acres. I think it's a little more than half acre and under 10 acres in size, and also at 30 units per acre. And so the city, however, does have other sites available that could be developed for lower income housing. And we also have sites that could redevelop. They're not listed on this site's inventory. We do have a program incorporated in the housing element where we will continue to prepare a list and a map of all of those additional sites that maybe didn't meet this HCD criteria, but that are actually still potentially available for housing.
It's important to note that housing development is not limited only to the sites in the inventory.
Is there anybody else that'd like to raise your hand? Charlene, go ahead. You can continue speaking.
Thanks. Thanks for that response, Cindy. That's helpful. We're certainly planning to submit much more detailed written comments.
Okay.
But another thing that I had a concern about is that the low-income units that the sites for low-income units that have been identified are sort of in a narrow half-mile wide strip all down East Street, with the exception of a couple spots by Woodland High School, and there aren't any sites that are identified in the traditionally more affluent areas on like the western side of the city and in the Spring Lake area. So I know that you mentioned that there's going to be an additional affirmatively furthering fair housing assessment coming later, but we're concerned about the location of the sites because it seems like they're being kept in kind of a restricted area in the more industrial and near the public housing. So we're wondering how they're going to be interspersed into the areas of opportunity.
I can take that from and you can kind of fill in some of the gaps with the fair housing subsidy. So the sites identified for the lower income do have to meet certain criteria, as Cindy mentioned. So they have to be of a certain size and a certain, they have to be a certain size and they have to meet density requirements because of the state's the state's understanding that it is more difficult to qualify for federal support and funding support at lower densities. So it's more likely to develop lower income housing at certain minimum densities. So these are the sites that do meet those criteria that are currently vacant. So that is one of the reasons why you will see them in areas along a stretch of the city. One of the things that regarding affirmatively furthering fair housing, we also think of it a little bit as two sides of a coin of dispersing affordable housing in areas of opportunity, but also improving the conditions in areas where lower income housing currently is or potentially could be. So, bringing up those areas, providing more opportunity in those areas as well. So I think the pending analysis will help illuminate some of those issues and help the city develop some recommendations on how to address both the distribution of lower income housing as well as improving the opportunities in the areas where housing already exists.
Yes, I just to add on to that briefly, we are in the process of updating our comprehensive zoning code, and although we do have adequate sites, one of the intents of the zoning code is to take a look at, of course, utilizing, for example, form-based codes and allowing for integration of whether it's triplexes, fourplexes, other types of housing into other parts of the city, particularly the lower density areas. And there is some possibility for consideration of even increasing densities in some locations. So that was one of the issues. For example, in Spring Lake, in our last housing element, we had a minimum default density of 20 units to the acre. And so we have, Spring Lake has a zoning that is an R25, for example. And so sites that were designated R25 were thought to meet our affordable housing criteria for the lower income housing. Now this year, in this housing element, the default density is at 30 units per acre. And so some of the sites that previously had been shown as available for lower income, like I said, example in Spring Lake, don't meet the criteria. However, that does not mean that site may not develop as a lower income housing site. I think, as you know, unfortunately, as much as we would love to see a mixed income market rate project develop, the city is actually having a great deal of trouble achieving that kind of development. In fact, any of the multifamily that has developed in the city has been 100% affordable. And it looks like that trend may be continuing. I think the problem is with the cost of construction, the cost of materials, labor. We are hearing that it's just difficult to make pro formas pencil for the market rate type product in which you would have a certain percentage qualified for lower income. So, we anticipate seeing a great deal of additional lower income housing product types in higher opportunity areas, even though the sites right now are not showing as qualified as lower income.
Is there anybody else that would like to speak? Oh, you're still able to talk.
Sorry, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but if nobody else is going to raise their hand, I will. I did have a kind of a specific question that I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer. But I noticed in the evaluation of past programs, number 9A11, there was just something that I didn't understand. Let me see where that one was. relating to the existing affordable housing ordinance. It says under modify, delete, or continue, it says no ongoing action established as a policy or delete. So I was wondering if that means that the affordable housing ordinance is going to be changed or removed, or if that requirement is going to continue for non-affordable developments going forward.
Yeah, I can answer that. So what that means is that the housing element previously identified this as a program, which is really more of an actionable, should be more of an action item. So developing ordinances or implementing things or working and identifying funding. So this is actually a policy now to continue to enforce the Spring Lake specific plan and affordable housing ordinances, not to get rid of them. So both of those are still in place, and it is very much the city's policy to continue to utilize both the affordable housing ordinance and any Spring Lake specific plan affordability requirements in projects that come forward. Does that clarify what we mean by moving it from a program to just establishing it as ongoing policy?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Doesn't look like we have anybody else with a hand raised.
Well, I see we have a few additional folks on, and a couple of folks have dropped off now. If there are no other comments, I want to thank everybody for your time and attending and your comments. And, we look forward to receiving additional comments and to help us, make the housing element a document that is, beneficial to the community of Woodland. So, again, I just want to thank you, and I guess meeting's adjourned.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Jay.
Yep.